The putrid stench had been seeping through the walls for 3 weeks, growing stronger each day, until Marcus could barely breathe in his own apartment. He'd complained to his landlord countless times, begged maintenance to investigate, even threatened to call the health department. But nothing prepared him for what he discovered when he finally traced that nauseating odor to its source. Behind a false wall in the basement, hidden beneath years of neglect and deliberate concealment, lay evidence of something far more sinister than a simple plumbing issue. What Marcus found that day would expose a web of lies, corruption, and cruelty that had been festering in his building for decades. The smell was just the beginning. What lurked beneath would change everything he thought he knew about the place he called home. Marcus Chen had always been the kind of person who minded his own business. At 32, he worked as a software developer for a mid-sized tech company downtown, spending his days debugging code and his evenings unwinding in the modest one-bedroom apartment he'd called home for the past 4 years. The Riverside Gardens apartment complex wasn't much to look at from the outside. A weathered brick building from the 1960s with peeling paint around the windows and a perpetually broken intercom system, but it was affordable, reasonably quiet, and only 20 minutes from his office by subway. The building housed 12 units across 3 floors, and Marcus had grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of his neighbors' lives. Mrs. Rodriguez in 2A always had her television volume turned up too high during her evening telenovelas. The college students in 3B threw parties every Friday night that ended precisely at midnight, as if they'd set an alarm. Mr. Petrov from 1C shuffled down to check his mail at exactly 3:30 every afternoon, wearing the same faded blue cardigan regardless of the season. Marcus had chosen Unit 2C specifically because it sat at the back of the building, away from the street noise and the constant foot traffic near the main entrance. His apartment overlooked a small courtyard where a few stubborn weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete, and an ancient oak tree provided just enough shade to keep his living room cool during the summer months. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on his work, pursue his hobby of building vintage electronics, and save money for the house he hoped to buy someday. The landlord, Vincent Carlucci, was a heavy-set man in his 60s who owned 3 buildings in the neighborhood. He'd inherited the properties from his father and ran them with what he called old-school efficiency. This meant repairs were handled on his timeline, rent increases came like clockwork every year, and tenant complaints were met with a shrug and a promise to look into it when he had time. But the rent was below market rate, and Marcus had learned to fix minor issues himself rather than wait weeks for maintenance to show up. Carlucci had a peculiar habit of conducting surprise inspections, always claiming he needed to check for safety violations or unauthorized modifications. He'd arrive unannounced with his massive keyring, letting himself in whether tenants were home or not. Most residents had grown accustomed to these intrusions, viewing them as the price of affordable rent in an increasingly expensive city. Marcus had always found the inspections invasive, but tolerated them, understanding that fighting with landlords rarely ended well for tenants. The building superintendent, Joey Russo, was Carlucci's nephew, a wiry man with calloused hands and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow who seemed to know every inch of the property's aging infrastructure. Joey lived in the basement apartment, a converted storage space that Carlucci rented to him at a steep discount in exchange for handling maintenance calls and keeping an eye on the building. He was competent enough at fixing leaky faucets and replacing burned-out hallway bulbs, but he had an unsettling way of appearing in the corridors at odd hours, always claiming he was checking on something, or responding to a complaint no one remembered making. Marcus's routine was simple and predictable. He woke at 6:30 each morning, made coffee with beans from the Ethiopian place down the street, and caught the 7:45 train downtown. His workdays were spent in a climate-controlled office building, writing code and attending video conferences with clients across the country. He'd return home around 7, grab dinner from one of the family-owned restaurants in the neighborhood, and spend his evenings either working on personal projects or reading technical manuals. Weekends were for errands, laundry, and the occasional visit to his parents in Queens. His mother still worried that he lived alone in that old building, and regularly suggested he move closer to family. But Marcus valued his independence. He'd grown up in a cramped apartment with 3 siblings, and the quiet solitude of his current home felt like a luxury he'd earned. Through years of careful budgeting and disciplined saving, the first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in late September. Marcus had just finished a particularly challenging debugging session and was looking forward to a quiet night when he noticed an unusual smell in his kitchen. It was faint at first, a musty organic odor that reminded him of forgotten vegetables in a refrigerator crisper drawer. He checked his trash, examined the contents of his refrigerator, and even pulled out his stove to look for anything that might be decomposing behind it. Finding nothing, he opened his windows to air out the apartment and assumed the smell would dissipate overnight. But Wednesday morning brought the same odor, now slightly stronger and more pervasive. It seemed to be coming from somewhere within the walls themselves, as if something was rotting in the building's infrastructure. By Thursday, the smell had spread beyond his kitchen. Marcus could detect it in his bedroom, his bathroom, even in the hallway outside his apartment door. It had evolved from a simple mustiness into something more complex and disturbing, sweet and putrid, with undertones that made his stomach turn. He'd lived in enough apartments to recognize the signs of plumbing problems, pest infestations, and poor ventilation, but this was different. This smell carried an almost organic quality that suggested something living had become something decidedly not living. Marcus prided himself on being a reasonable tenant. He'd never been late with rent, never caused problems for his neighbors, and handled minor maintenance issues himself whenever possible. But this odor was beyond his ability to diagnose or fix. It was affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to concentrate on work. Worse, it seemed to be getting stronger each day, as if whatever was causing it was growing, spreading, or decomposing further. On Friday morning, Marcus decided it was time to call his landlord. He had no idea that this simple phone call would unravel secrets that had been buried in the building's foundation for over 20 years, or that the mysterious smell was just the first thread in a web of corruption, neglect, and deliberate cruelty that would test everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the lengths people will go to protect their darkest secrets. Marcus's first call to Vincent Carlucci went straight to voicemail. He left a polite, detailed message explaining the smell, its location, and his concerns about potential plumbing or structural issues. He expected a call back within a day or two. After all, mysterious odors in apartment buildings usually indicated problems that could affect multiple units and property values. 3 days passed without a response. By Monday, the smell had intensified to the point where Marcus could barely eat breakfast in his kitchen. He called again, this time reaching Carlucci directly. The landlord's voice carried its usual gruff dismissiveness as he claimed he'd been busy with other properties and promised to send Joey to investigate sometime that week. When Marcus pressed for a specific time frame, explaining that the odor was making his apartment nearly uninhabitable. Carlucci's tone shifted from dismissive to irritated. "Listen, Chen, I've been managing these buildings for 30 years. Smells come and go. Open a window, buy some air freshener, and stop being so dramatic." The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, stunned by the casual cruelty in his landlord's voice. He'd never made unreasonable demands, never complained about minor inconveniences, never been anything but a model tenant. Yet Carlucci had treated his legitimate concern like a personal annoyance, rather than a potentially serious maintenance issue. That evening, Marcus knocked on Mrs. Rodriguez's door to ask if she'd noticed any unusual odors. The elderly woman invited him in, serving coffee and homemade empanadas, while explaining that yes, she'd detected something unpleasant for the past week, but assumed it was related to the ongoing construction at the building next door. She'd grown accustomed to tolerating problems rather than complaining, she admitted, because Carlucci had a reputation for making life difficult for tenants who caused trouble. This was the first Marcus had heard about retaliatory behavior from their landlord. Mrs. Rodriguez lowered her voice as she shared stories about previous tenants who'd filed complaints with the city or demanded repairs. There was Maria Santos, who'd reported a gas leak and found herself served with an eviction notice for violating lease terms the following month. There was David Kim, who'd requested lead paint testing after his daughter developed respiratory problems and suddenly discovered his lease wouldn't be renewed. Most disturbing was the case of Janet Phillips, an elderly woman who'd lived in 3A for 15 years before complaining about her non-functional heating system. Within weeks, she'd received notices for violations she'd never committed. Harassment from Joey about unauthorized pets despite owning no animals, and eventually an eviction lawsuit that forced her to move out rather than fight an expensive legal battle. "Vincent doesn't like tenants who ask questions," Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, glancing toward her door as if expecting someone to be listening. "He especially doesn't like tenants who know their rights." Marcus left her apartment with a growing sense of unease. The smell was no longer just an inconvenience. It was becoming a test of whether he'd stand up for himself or join the ranks of tenants who suffered in silence to avoid their landlord's wrath. Wednesday brought Joey's promised visit, but not the investigation Marcus had expected. The superintendent arrived at 7 in the morning, pounding on the door with enough force to wake the entire floor. When Marcus answered, still in his pajamas and clearly having been asleep, Joey pushed past him into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "Carlucci says you're complaining about smells," Joey announced, walking directly to the kitchen and opening cabinets without explanation. "Looks fine to me. You sure you're not just a clean freak who can't handle normal building odors?" Marcus watched in growing anger as Joey conducted what could barely be called an inspection. The man spent less than 3 minutes in the kitchen, didn't check any plumbing, made no attempt to trace the source of the odor, and seemed more interested in examining Marcus's personal belongings than identifying maintenance issues. When Marcus tried to explain that the smell was strongest near the wall shared with the neighboring unit, Joey cut him off. "I don't smell anything. Maybe you should see a doctor about your nose." Before leaving, Joey made a show of photographing Marcus's kitchen, claiming he needed documentation for the landlord. The implication was clear. Marcus was being portrayed as a problem tenant, rather than someone reporting a legitimate concern. That afternoon, Marcus received an email from Carlucci that made his blood run cold. The message, copied to Joey and someone named Legal Services, informed him that repeated frivolous complaints were in violation of his lease agreement's quiet enjoyment clause. The email went on to suggest that tenants who couldn't adapt to normal building conditions might be happier elsewhere, and threatened to charge him for unnecessary maintenance calls if he continued to report issues that trained maintenance staff couldn't identify. Marcus read the email 3 times, unable to believe that seeking help with a serious odor problem had been twisted into grounds for potential eviction. He'd never encountered such blatant landlord harassment, but Mrs. Rodriguez's warnings were proving prophetic. Carlucci wasn't just dismissing his complaint, he was actively punishing him for making it. The smell continued to worsen throughout the week. By Friday, Marcus was sleeping with his windows open despite the October chill, running air purifiers constantly, and eating most of his meals outside his apartment. He'd started working late at the office just to avoid spending time in his own home. The odor had evolved into something truly nauseating, a sweet, rotting stench that clung to his clothes and followed him into the hallway. Other tenants were beginning to notice. Marcus overheard conversations about the smell in the laundry room, where residents whispered about something dead in the walls and sewage problems. But when he tried to organize a group complaint, hoping that multiple voices might force Carlucci to take action, he discovered how effectively the landlord's intimidation tactics had worked. Mr. Petrov claimed he hadn't noticed any odors and seemed nervous even discussing the topic. The college students in 3B admitted they'd smelled something, but quickly backtracked when Marcus mentioned involving the landlord, insisting they didn't want to cause problems so close to lease renewal time. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been sympathetic earlier, now seemed reluctant to get involved in anything. That might be seen as organizing tenant resistance. Marcus was beginning to understand the psychological warfare Carlucci employed to maintain control over his properties. By making examples of tenants who complained, he'd created an atmosphere of fear that discouraged others from asserting their rights. The man wasn't just a negligent landlord. He was systematically suppressing legitimate maintenance requests through intimidation and retaliation. The breaking point came the following Monday. Marcus returned home from work to find a notice taped to his door, an official lease violation warning, claiming he'd been creating disturbances and making false reports to management. The document, printed on legal letterhead, threatened eviction proceedings if he continued to harass building staff with frivolous complaints. Standing in his hallway, breathing air that now reeked so badly he had to cover his nose with his shirt, Marcus felt something snap inside him. The injustice was breathtaking. He was being threatened with eviction for reporting a smell so powerful that visitors to the building were commenting on it. Carlucci wasn't just ignoring a maintenance issue. He was actively punishing Marcus for refusing to suffer in silence. That evening, Marcus began documenting everything. He photographed the violation notice, saved every email from Carlucci and Joey, and started a detailed log of the smell's progression. He researched tenant rights laws, contacted the city's housing authority about inspection procedures, and began building a case that went far beyond a simple maintenance request. But as he researched similar cases online, Marcus discovered stories that made his situation look mild by comparison. Tenants who'd been evicted through fabricated violations, others who'd faced harassment campaigns lasting months, and some who'd simply given up and moved, rather than fight landlords with deeper pockets and more legal resources. The system seemed designed to favor property owners who were willing to abuse their power. while tenants had few realistic options for fighting back. The smell was now so overwhelming that Marcus had started staying at a nearby hotel on weekends, an expense he could barely afford, but felt necessary for his physical and mental health. He'd lost weight from avoiding his kitchen, developed headaches from constantly breathing putrid air, and found himself dreading the return home each evening. What had started as a simple maintenance request had become a daily assault on his quality of life. By the end of October, Marcus realized he was facing a choice that went far beyond his own comfort. He could surrender, accept that Carlucci's intimidation tactics were effective, and either suffer in silence or move out like so many tenants before him. Or he could fight back, knowing that the landlord had already demonstrated his willingness to escalate the conflict and make Marcus's life miserable. The decision became inevitable when Marcus discovered he wasn't Carlucci's only target. Through careful conversations with other tenants, he learned about a pattern of retaliation that stretched back years. The landlord systematically suppressed maintenance requests by threatening anyone who complained, creating conditions where serious problems festered unaddressed while tenants suffered in silence. But Marcus had also noticed something Carlucci might not have anticipated. The smell wasn't just affecting his apartment anymore. It was spreading throughout the building, growing stronger and more pervasive each day. Whatever was causing the odor was getting worse, and soon it would be impossible for even the most intimidated tenant to ignore. Standing in his kitchen on Halloween night, breathing air so foul it made his eyes water, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to be another cautionary tale about tenants who challenged their landlords and lost. He was going to find out what was causing that smell, document every aspect of Carlucci's negligence and retaliation, and make sure the truth came to light. He had no idea that his investigation would uncover secrets dark enough to destroy lives, or that the mysterious odor was connected to crimes that had been hidden in the building's foundation for decades. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a frigid November night, when Marcus couldn't sleep, because the smell had become so overpowering that even his closed bedroom door couldn't keep it out. He'd been lying awake for hours, breathing through his mouth and fighting waves of nausea, when he heard something that made his blood run colder, sound like dripping water coming from somewhere, deep within the building's walls. Marcus had spent weeks documenting every aspect of his deteriorating living conditions, photographing the progression of stains that had begun appearing on his kitchen wall, recording the intensifying odor, and building a case against Carlucci's systematic negligence. But this sound was different. This wasn't the familiar settling of old pipes, or the occasional creaking of aging wood. This was the unmistakable rhythm of liquid falling onto something solid, somewhere it shouldn't be falling. Armed with a flashlight and driven by desperation that had overcome his usual caution, Marcus made his way to the building's basement. He'd been down there only once before, when Joey had shown him the storage lockers during his move-in tour 4 years earlier. The basement was a maze of utility rooms, storage spaces, and mechanical equipment that few tenants ever saw. But tonight, the smell that had been torturing him for months was so concentrated down here that Marcus had to breathe through his shirt to avoid retching. Following the sound of dripping and the increasingly putrid odor, Marcus traced a path through the basement's dim corridors until he reached a section he'd never seen before, a series of rooms behind the main utility area that appeared to have been deliberately concealed. The smell here was so overwhelming that his eyes began watering uncontrollably, but the sound of dripping was now clearly coming from behind a makeshift wall that looked hastily constructed and poorly maintained. What? Marcus discovered next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The false wall had been built to hide a room that contained evidence of Carlucci's darkest secrets. But it wasn't just the rotting corpse of a long-time tenant who'd been reported as moved away 3 years earlier that made Marcus's legs give out beneath him. It was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. Scattered throughout the hidden space were personal belongings, identification documents, and decomposing remains that told the story of multiple tenants who had simply disappeared over the past 2 decades. Mrs. Chen from 1B, who'd supposedly moved back to China to care for elderly parents. Robert Martinez, who'd allegedly broken his lease early to take a job in another state. Sarah Thompson, the young nurse who'd lived in 3C before Marcus moved in, whose sudden departure had been explained as a family emergency that required immediate relocation. All of them were here, in various stages of decomposition, along with evidence that painted a horrifying picture of systematic murder disguised as normal tenant turnover. Carlucci hadn't just been retaliating against tenants who complained. He'd been eliminating those who posed the greatest threats to his operation, then covering their deaths by creating plausible stories about voluntary relocations. The smell that had been torturing Marcus for months was the collective decomposition of multiple victims, their bodies hidden behind a wall that was now failing due to the building's aging infrastructure. The maintenance issues Carlucci refused to address weren't just negligence. They were part of a deliberate strategy to keep tenants and authorities away from areas where evidence was hidden. As Marcus stood in that chamber of horrors, his phone's flashlight illuminating details too gruesome to fully process, he heard footsteps in the corridor behind him. Joey's voice echoed through the basement, calling out that he'd seen lights where there shouldn't be any, that someone was trespassing in areas tenants weren't allowed to access. Marcus realized with crystal clarity that he'd stumbled onto something that people had been killed to protect, and that his own complaints about the smell had marked him as the next potential victim. Every threatening email, every intimidation tactic, every attempt to silence his concerns, it had all been leading to this moment when he'd become too dangerous to let live. The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare sequence that Marcus's mind could barely comprehend. Joey appeared in the doorway, took one look at Marcus standing among the evidence of multiple murders, and reached for something in his jacket pocket. But Marcus had spent months building his case against Carlucci, and tonight he'd come prepared with more than just a flashlight. His phone had been recording everything since he'd entered the basement, uploading video directly to cloud storage as evidence of what he was discovering. More importantly, he'd set up an automated system that would alert authorities and send his evidence to multiple recipients if he failed to check in by a specific time each day. His weeks of paranoid preparation, driven by Carlucci's escalating threats, had inadvertently created a dead man's switch that Joey couldn't disable by simply eliminating Marcus. The confrontation that followed was brutal and desperate, with Joey realizing that killing Marcus would only ensure that evidence of the murders would reach authorities within hours. Marcus fought with the fury of someone who finally understood the true scope of the evil he'd been battling, while Joey struggled with the dawning knowledge that decades of carefully concealed crimes were about to be exposed. When building residents were awakened by sounds of struggle from the basement, followed by Marcus's screams for help that echoed through the building's ventilation system, the conspiracy of silence that had protected Carlucci finally cracked. Tenants who'd been too intimidated to support Marcus's complaints about the smell now found themselves calling 911 about sounds that clearly indicated someone was immortal. Danger. The police response that followed turned the Riverside Gardens apartment complex into a crime scene that would dominate local news for months. Marcus's evidence, months of documentation about landlord harassment, combined with the horrifying discoveries in the basement, provided investigators with a roadmap to decades of systematic murder that had been disguised as normal business operations. Carlucci's arrest, when it came, was almost anticlimactic compared to the revelation of how he'd maintained control over his properties. The man who'd terrorized tenants with threats of eviction and retaliation had been literally killing those who refused to be silenced, then covering their murders by creating believable stories about voluntary relocations. His old-school efficiency hadn't just been about ignoring maintenance requests, it had been about maintaining an environment where tenants were too frightened to investigate anything suspicious. The basement crime scene revealed evidence of at least 8 murders spanning 23 years, with victims chosen specifically because they'd posed threats to Carlucci's operation. Some had been tenants who discovered irregularities in building records or questioned suspicious disappearances. Others had been housing inspectors, social workers, or journalists who'd gotten too close to uncovering the truth. Joey's role as superintendent had provided perfect cover for disposing of bodies and maintaining the hidden burial ground. His basement apartment had given him unrestricted access to concealed areas where evidence could be hidden, while his position as Carlucci's nephew ensured his loyalty and silence. The two men had created a system where complaints about building conditions were met with escalating intimidation, culminating in murder for those who refused to be silenced. As Marcus sat in a hospital bed, being treated for injuries sustained during his fight with Joey, he watched news coverage that transformed him from a problem tenant into a hero who'd exposed one of the city's most shocking serial murder cases. The smell that had nearly driven him from his apartment had been the death cries of multiple victims, their decomposing bodies finally breaking through the barriers that had hidden them for decades. But the horror of what he'd discovered was tempered by the knowledge that his months of systematic documentation, driven by Carlucci's own harassment, had provided authorities with evidence that would ensure justice for victims whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. His refusal to be intimidated had not only saved his own life, but had finally given voice to the dead, who'd been silenced for far too long. Climax that had begun with a simple complaint about a bad smell had revealed a conspiracy of murder that stretched back to the previous century, transforming a landlord-tenant dispute into one of the most significant criminal investigations in the city's history. The trial of Vincent Carlucci became a media sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of urban housing corruption in ways the city had never seen before. Marcus's meticulous documentation, months of emails, photographs, recordings, and evidence gathered through his desperate attempt to get a simple maintenance issue addressed, formed the backbone of a prosecution case that revealed the systematic nature of Carlucci's crimes. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying in its scope. Forensic investigators working in the basement crime scene uncovered remains dating back to 1999, when Carlucci had inherited the buildings from his father and begun implementing his own twisted version of property management. Each victim had been chosen for the same reason Marcus had nearly been killed. They'd asked too many questions, demanded accountability, or refused to accept substandard living conditions in silence. The prosecution painted a picture of calculated evil that went far beyond simple greed. Carlucci hadn't just been cutting corners on maintenance to maximize profits. He'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose the dangerous conditions he was forcing tenants to endure. The pattern was chillingly consistent. Tenants would complain about serious issues, face escalating harassment and legal threats, and then simply disappear with plausible cover stories about voluntary relocations. What made the case particularly disturbing was how Carlucci had weaponized the very system designed to protect tenants. Lease violation notices, eviction threats, and legal intimidation, tools that should have been used responsibly, had become instruments of psychological torture that softened victims before their murders. The man had turned tenant rights law into a hunting ground, using his superior knowledge of legal procedures to terrorize people into submission before ultimately silencing them permanently. Joey Russo's cooperation with prosecutors revealed the mechanical details of how the murders had been carried out and concealed. His role as building superintendent had provided perfect cover for accessing apartments at any hour, disposing of bodies, and maintaining the hidden burial chamber. More disturbing was his testimony about how they'd selected victims, targeting those who seemed most likely to escalate complaints beyond the building level, particularly tenants with legal knowledge, government connections, or persistent personalities. The basement crime scene yielded evidence that painted individual pictures of each victim's final days. Personal belongings found with the remains told stories of people who'd been living normal lives right up until the moment they'd crossed Carlucci's invisible line from acceptable complainer to existential threat. Sarah Thompson, the nurse whose apartment Marcus had inherited, had been killed after filing complaints with the city health department about mold issues that Carlucci had ignored. Robert Martinez had died because he'd started asking other tenants about their experiences with landlord retaliation, potentially organizing collective action. Each victim's story resonated with Marcus in deeply personal ways, because he recognized the same progression of harassment and intimidation that had nearly led to his own death. The threatening emails, the fake lease violations, the attempts to isolate him from other tenants. Every tactic Carlucci had used against him had been perfected through decades of practice on previous victims who hadn't been lucky enough to survive the experience. The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecutors presented Marcus's phone, recordings from the night he'd discovered the hidden chamber. The audio captured not just his horror at finding the bodies, but Joey's confession during their struggle, desperate admissions about how many people they'd killed, how long they'd been operating, and how close Marcus had come to becoming another tenant, who moved away suddenly. Carlucci's defense team tried to portray the murders as isolated, incidents of passion rather than systematic elimination of threats. But Marcus's evidence made that argument impossible to sustain. His months of documentation showed a clear pattern of escalating harassment that matched the experiences described in victims' final communications with friends and family. The prosecution could demonstrate that every person found in that basement had gone through the same process of complaint, intimidation, and ultimate elimination. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Carlucci received 8 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, while Joey was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. But the legal victory was only the beginning of the case's broader impact on tenant rights and housing law enforcement. Marcus's experience sparked a citywide investigation into landlord practices that revealed systematic abuse across multiple properties and management companies. His documentation methods, photographing conditions, recording interactions, maintaining detailed logs of harassment, became a template that tenant rights organizations distributed to vulnerable renters throughout the city. The case demonstrated how individual tenants could build legal protection against retaliation by creating evidence trails that made them too dangerous to eliminate quietly. The Riverside Gardens building was condemned and demolished within 6 months of the trial's conclusion, but not before becoming an unlikely pilgrimage site for tenant rights activists and true crime enthusiasts. The city used the case to justify sweeping reforms in landlord licensing, mandatory inspection protocols, and tenant protection laws that made Carlucci's tactics significantly more difficult to implement. More importantly, the case changed how authorities investigated tenant disappearances and suspicious lease terminations. Marcus's near-death experience revealed how easily vulnerable renters could vanish without triggering meaningful investigations, particularly when their disappearances could be explained by plausible relocation stories. New protocols required verification of tenant welfare before accepting landlord claims about voluntary departures, especially in cases involving previous complaint histories. The personal toll of his experience left Marcus forever changed, but also strangely empowered. His months of living in fear, breathing putrid air and facing systematic harassment had ultimately saved not just his own life but had prevented countless future murders. The smell that had nearly driven him from his apartment had been the voices of the dead, finally breaking through the barriers that had silenced them for decades. Marcus used his settlement money from the wrongful death lawsuit, filed on behalf of all identified victims, to establish a foundation providing legal aid to tenants facing landlord retaliation. His organization offered the kind of support he desperately needed during his own ordeal: documentation assistance, legal representation, and most importantly, the knowledge that tenants facing harassment weren't alone in their struggles. The Foundation's work revealed that Carlucci's methods, while extreme in their ultimate outcome, were variations on intimidation tactics used by abusive landlords throughout the city. The psychological warfare of fake violations, strategic harassment, and legal threats was far more common than anyone had realized. Marcus's case had exposed not just individual crimes, but a broader system of abuse that relied on tenant isolation and ignorance of legal rights. Years later, as Marcus stood in his new home, a house he'd eventually been able to purchase thanks to the settlement and his foundation work, he reflected on how a simple complaint about a bad smell had led to exposing one of the city's most shocking criminal conspiracies. The odor that had tormented him for months had been more than just evidence of Carlucci's negligence. It had been a desperate signal from victims who'd been silenced, but refused to be forgotten. The case became a cautionary tale about the importance of persisting in the face of intimidation, documenting everything when facing powerful opponents, and understanding that sometimes the most horrible truths hide behind the most mundane problems. Marcus's refusal to accept substandard living conditions hadn't just improved his own situation, it had given justice to 8 people whose voices had been silenced by violence and whose disappearances had been covered up by lies. The story of the Riverside Gardens murders served as a reminder that evil often prospers not through grand conspiracies, but through the everyday indifference of people who choose not to ask difficult questions or challenge uncomfortable truths. Marcus's courage in refusing to accept that a bad smell was just something he had to live with had ultimately exposed decades of systematic murder disguised as routine business operations. But perhaps the most important lesson from Marcus's ordeal was simpler and more universal. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to suffer in silence. His insistence on documenting his harassment, building evidence of retaliation, and persisting despite escalating threats had created the very documentation that saved his life and brought justice to forgotten victims. The smell had given it away, but what Marcus found was indeed worse than anyone could have imagined. Yet his willingness to follow that odor to its source, despite every instinct telling him to accept his situation and stay quiet, had transformed a story of individual suffering into a victory for justice that would protect vulnerable tenants for generations to come. In the end, Marcus learned that the most dangerous thing a person can do when facing systematic abuse isn't to fight back. It's to document everything, persist despite intimidation, and refuse to let the powerful silence the truth through fear. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.